My name is David Mercer, and from the outside, it seems like I have everything. A thriving legal career that catapulted me into the upper echelons of society, and a wife, Amelia, whose beauty and charm could enchant anyone. We were the picture of success, a power couple admired and envied by many. But beneath the perfect facade, our ambitions would become the poison that would slowly rot everything we had built. I can still recall the night I proposed to Amelia in a candlelit restaurant overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Her eyes sparkled, not just with love, but with the same hunger for success that I felt deep within me. From the beginning, we understood each other in ways no one else could. She was a director at one of the most prestigious wellness spas in the country, and her rise to the top was as rapid as mine. Together, we believed we could conquer the world. In those early years, we dreamed big, fueled by our ambitions. Every victory I achieved in the courtroom felt like another step closer to the power and fame I craved. And Amelia, with her magnetic personality, expanded her influence in the luxury wellness industry. We were a perfect team, pushing each other toward bigger goals, unafraid to bend the rules if necessary. But success, like a drug, can consume you. I began to realize how much I was willing to sacrifice to get ahead. There were times when I ignored the law's gray areas, justifying that the end always justified the means. And Amelia? She was willing to do anything to stay on top, even if that meant using her charm in ways that made my blood boil. It was subtle at first, the flirtatious smiles she exchanged with potential investors at spa events, the way her voice softened when she spoke to powerful men who could open doors for her. I convinced myself it was harmless, that this was just how the game was played. After all, I wasn't much better. My thirst for fame and recognition made me blind to the boundaries I was crossing in my own profession. We were both feeding the same monster, our ambition. I brushed off the small pangs of jealousy and guilt, burying them beneath the layers of success that kept piling up. But soon, the cracks in our perfect facade started to show. I remember the first time I truly noticed the distance between us. It was at one of those glamorous fundraising galas where I was the guest of honor, celebrating yet another high-profile case victory. Amelia looked stunning, as always, her laughter filling the room like a melody. But there was something different in her eyes that night, a hunger I had never seen before, one that wasn't just about ambition anymore. When we arrived home, the conversation we had was like a slap in the face. She casually mentioned a new investor she was courting for her spa, someone I knew had a reputation for mixing business with pleasure. The way she spoke about him sent a chill down my spine. "He's different, David. He has the kind of connections that could take us both to the next level," she said, her tone indifferent, as if this was all part of some grand strategy. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the woman I once knew. "And what exactly are you willing to do for those connections?" I asked, trying to mask the bitterness in my voice. Her eyes flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance. "Don't be so naive. This is how it works at the top. We use what we have to get what we want. We both do." It was the first time I truly felt the chasm between us, the realization that our ambitions had taken us down separate paths. I had always believed that we were in this together, but now I wasn't so sure. Amelia had become a stranger to me, a woman who was willing to sell out parts of herself in ways I had never imagined. And yet, I couldn't fully blame her. Wasn't I doing the same in my own way? Sacrificing integrity for the sake of climbing higher? But the truth was, Amelia wasn't just after power. She was willing to cross lines I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of our unraveling. It was the night I began to question everything about us, about the life we had built and the price we were willing to pay for it. As I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling, I wondered, how far would we go before there was nothing left of the people we once were? How far could ambition drive us before we lost each other for good? The weeks following that gala were the beginning of an emotional distance I hadn't anticipated. Amelia and I were still the power couple, outwardly flawless, with friends, colleagues, and business associates praising our success. But I knew something had changed, something subtle but significant. It was like a hairline fracture in glass, slowly spreading until the whole surface shatters. Amelia had always been ambitious, but her recent behavior was different. There was a calculation in her moves that I hadn't noticed before, an unspoken understanding that our marriage, in her eyes, was just another step toward success. I suppose I had been complicit in it for years, turning a blind eye to the increasingly transactional nature of our relationship. Her business ventures at the spa had become more demanding, with late nights and trips that kept her away for days at a time. When she was home, she was distracted, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from clients or investors. I started wondering if these relationships were more than just professional, but I didn't dare confront her directly. Not yet. Instead, I threw myself into my work, taking on even more cases than usual. The law was my refuge. In the courtroom, I had control, I had power, and I didn't have to think about what was unraveling at home. I kept winning, but the victories began to feel hollow. No matter how much fame or recognition I gained, it couldn't fill the growing void in my marriage. One night, after a particularly grueling case, I came home to an empty house. Amelia had left me a note, scribbled carelessly on a piece of paper. Late meeting with investors. Don't wait up. I crumpled the note in my hand, frustration boiling inside me. I knew these meetings had nothing to do with business anymore, but I couldn't prove it. She was too careful, too smooth in her deceptions. And truth be told, I wasn't entirely innocent either. My own affairs had started innocently enough. Dinners with clients, late nights at the office that bled into something more. I justified it by telling myself that Amelia was the one who had drifted first, that I was merely responding to the distance she created. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. We had both been playing this game for too long, chasing our own ambitions at the cost of our relationship. It was during one of these nights, while I was out with a colleague named Claire, that I realized just how far I had fallen. Claire was smart, driven, and undeniably attractive. She worked at a rival law firm, and we had crossed paths on several cases. Our dinners had always been professional, until that night. We had been drinking, laughing about a case we both knew was destined to fail, when the conversation took a personal turn. She asked me about Amelia, about our marriage, and I found myself admitting things I hadn't even said aloud to myself. "Do you ever feel like it's all slipping away?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Claire studied me for a moment before answering. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes. But the real question is, do you want to hold on to it?" I didn't answer right away, did I? Amelia and I had built a life together, one that was the envy of so many. But what was left of us now? A partnership of convenience? A facade? "I don't know," I finally said, my voice heavy with the weight of that truth. Claire leaned in closer, her hand brushing against mine. "Sometimes it's okay to let go, David. Sometimes that's the only way to move forward." I don't know if it was the alcohol or the loneliness that pushed me, but I found myself leaning in as well until her lips met mine. It was quick, a brief kiss that was over before it had really begun. But it was enough to shake me, enough to remind me that I was walking the same dangerous path as Amelia. I pulled back, guilt flooding me instantly. "I can't," I muttered, more to myself than to her. Claire smiled softly, understanding in her eyes. "It's okay, David. No one's perfect." I left shortly after, the air between us awkward but not hostile. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. It wasn't about Claire. It was about the realization that I was no better than Amelia. We had both crossed lines, both betrayed each other in different ways, and now we were left to navigate the wreckage of what was once a marriage. When I got home, Amelia was already in bed, her back turned to me. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, wondering if she could sense how much had changed. If she felt the same cracks that I did, or if she was content to let the distance between us grow. I climbed into bed next to her, careful not to touch her. The space between us felt like an ocean, vast and uncrossable. And yet, we both lay there, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that we hadn't already lost each other. The next morning, as I got ready for work, Amelia was already gone. Another note on the kitchen counter. Early flight to LA for a business meeting. Back in a few days. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. The truth was, I didn't know if I wanted her to come back. The days after Amelia's trip to Los Angeles felt like a blur, as if I was living in a daze. The routine remained the same. Case after case, court dates, meetings with clients, but beneath the surface, there was a tension I couldn't shake. Something was brewing, something darker than anything I had felt before, and it all seemed to center around the growing temptation that had wrapped itself around my life like a vine. Amelia's absence, both physically and emotionally, left a void that was hard to ignore. The distance between us had become more than just space. It was emotional isolation. And as much as I tried to keep myself busy with work, the whispers of temptation began to creep into my mind, louder and more persistent than ever. Claire hadn't mentioned that kiss again. In fact, we hadn't spoken outside of professional matters since that night. But it was clear that something had shifted between us. She knew it. I knew it. There was an unspoken understanding that we had crossed a line, and once crossed, it was nearly impossible to go back. But Claire wasn't the only temptation. Every aspect of my life had started to feel like a test of my willpower. The late nights at the office turned into more than just opportunities for hard work. I found myself surrounded by people who admired me, paralegals, colleagues, even clients who flirted with the idea of something more. The temptation was everywhere, whispering to me, offering an escape from the wreckage that was my marriage. And then there was Amelia. Her trip to Los Angeles stretched longer than she had initially said. Just a few days had turned into a week, and then another week after that. I had stopped asking her when she was coming back. Instead, I threw myself into a case that would make national headlines, a murder trial that had the media buzzing. It was high stakes, and I relished the challenge. But even in the courtroom, I couldn't escape the whispers. During a break in the trial, I received a text from Amelia. Staying longer in LA. Meeting going well. Don't wait up for me. I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. Meeting? Was that really what she was doing? My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. Was she seeing someone else? Had she found someone in Los Angeles who could fulfill her ambitions in ways I no longer could? I didn't respond. Instead, I shoved my phone into my pocket and returned to the courtroom, determined to push every thought of her out of my mind. But as the day went on, I found it harder and harder to focus. By the time the trial wrapped for the day, I felt drained, not from the legal battle I was fighting, but from the internal war that had been raging in my mind for weeks. That night, I went to a bar near my office, hoping a drink or two would quiet the storm inside me. I sat at the counter, nursing a whiskey, when I heard a familiar voice beside me. "Well, this is a surprise," Claire said, sliding onto the stool next to mine. I looked up, startled. "Claire, hey! I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled, though there was something knowing in her eyes. "I could say the same about you. Tough case?" I shrugged, taking another sip of my drink. "You could say that." We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I knew why she was here, and I knew what she wanted, even if neither of us was willing to admit it yet. "I heard about Amelia," she said suddenly, her voice softer now. "The trip to LA, the long absences, is everything okay?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. Was everything okay? No, nothing was okay. But how could I explain that without admitting how much of a mess my life had become? "We're working through some things," I said, though even I didn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. Claire nodded, her eyes searching mine. "David, you don't have to pretend with me. I know what it's like to have a marriage falling apart. You can talk to me." Her words were like a lifeline, and for a moment, I considered grabbing onto it. I could open up to Claire, tell her everything that had been eating away at me for months. But what would that accomplish? She wasn't my wife. She couldn't fix what was broken between Amelia and me. And yet, the temptation was there, pulling me closer to her with every passing second. Claire was offering more than just a sympathetic ear. She was offering an escape, a way out of the mess my life had become. All I had to do was take it. "Claire," I began, but before I could finish, she placed her hand on mine, her touch sending a jolt through me. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. "I get it." Her hand lingered on mine for a moment longer, and I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The truth was, I wanted this. I wanted her. I wanted to forget about Amelia and the lies, the distance, the pain. I wanted to lose myself in someone who understood what I was going through, someone who could offer me a way out. Before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, And this time, the kiss wasn't brief. It was desperate, fueled by months of pent-up frustration and longing. It was everything I had been trying to resist, and yet, in that moment, I didn't care. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and dazed, I knew there was no turning back. I had crossed a line, again, but this time, it felt like there was no return. The whispers of temptation had become too loud to ignore, and I had finally given in. Claire looked at me, her eyes dark and full of understanding. "Come with me," she said, her voice low and urgent. And for a moment, I considered it. I considered leaving the bar with her, leaving everything behind, Amelia, my marriage, the life I had built. But something stopped me, a voice in the back of my mind that reminded me of the consequences, of the price I would have to pay. I stood up, shaking my head. "I can't." Claire looked disappointed, but she didn't push. "I understand," she said softly, "but just know, David, I'm here. Whenever you're ready." I nodded, unable to say anything more. Then I turned and walked out of the bar, the weight of what I had almost done pressing down on me like a stone. As I walked through the dark streets, the whispers of temptation still echoed in my mind, but now they were joined by something else, guilt. And I knew that no matter how much I tried to drown it out, it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The morning after my encounter with Claire, I felt the weight of what had almost happened settle over me like a thick fog. It wasn't just guilt. It was a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal toward Amelia, toward the life we had once promised each other. I had come so close to stepping over the edge, and while I hadn't completely crossed the line, I knew it was only a matter of time before the boundaries of our marriage dissolved entirely. Amelia still hadn't returned from Los Angeles, and my suspicion about her meetings had only grown. Each day I checked my phone, waiting for some sign of her, but all I got were more vague messages about extended business trips and new investors. I wanted to confront her, to ask her point blank if she was seeing someone else, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if the answer was yes? What would I do then? It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally received the confirmation I had been dreading. I was in my office, preparing for the final stages of the murder trial that had been dominating my time, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from a friend of mine, Peter, who worked in real estate in LA. He knew about Amelia's trip and had been keeping an eye out for her, more as a courtesy than anything else. But this time, his message was different. "Saw Amelia today at a restaurant in Beverly Hills. She wasn't alone." My stomach clenched as I stared at the text. I typed back quickly, my fingers trembling. "Who was she with?" A few minutes later, his reply came through. "A guy. Older, well-dressed. Seemed close. Sorry, man, didn't want to jump to conclusions, but thought you should know." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The image of Amelia sitting with another man, laughing, touching him the way she used to touch me, was enough to send my mind spiraling. There it was, confirmation of what I had feared all along. Amelia had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. For a long time, I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the papers in front of me. The whispers in my head were louder now, urging me to confront her, to demand the truth. But another part of me was paralyzed by the realization that we had both betrayed each other. What right did I have to accuse her when I had been so close to betraying her myself? That evening, I finally made the decision to call her. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. When she picked up the phone, her voice was light and cheerful, as if nothing had changed. "Hey, David," she said, sounding distracted. "I'm about to head into a dinner meeting. What's up?" I clenched the phone tighter in my hand, trying to keep my voice steady. "Amelia, we need to talk." She paused, sensing the tension in my voice. "Can this wait? I'm really busy tonight." "No, it can't wait," I said, the frustration boiling over. "Peter saw you today, at a restaurant, with another man." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up, but then she spoke, her voice low and measured. "David, I don't want to do this over the phone." "What are you doing, Amelia?" I demanded, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Who is he? Just tell me the truth." Another silence. Then she let out a long sigh. "His name is Robert. He's an investor I've been working with for months. We've gotten close." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I had already suspected as much. "Close?" I repeated, my voice cold. "What does that mean?" It means what you think it means, she said, her tone hardening. I didn't plan for it to happen, David, but it did, and I don't regret it. The bluntness of her confession left me reeling. I had expected her to deny it, to offer some excuse or explanation, but instead, she owned it. She didn't even seem to care how much it hurt me. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. A few months, she admitted. It started as business, but things changed. We both wanted something more. I couldn't breathe. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I had trusted, was admitting to an affair with no remorse, no guilt. And the worst part was, I couldn't even bring myself to hate her for it. Because deep down, I knew we had both contributed to the collapse of our marriage. We had let ambition and desire take precedence over everything else. So, what now? I asked, my voice shaking. Are you leaving me for him? I don't know, she said quietly. I need time to think. I'm not asking for forgiveness, David. I'm not even asking for you to understand. But I need to figure out what I want. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irreversible. She was already halfway out the door, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. All I could do was let her go. After the call ended, I sat in silence for what felt like hours. The weight of her betrayal crushed me, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The truth was out, and now, at least, I knew where we stood. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind the facade of a perfect marriage. But even as I tried to process everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The first betrayal had been exposed, but the consequences were far from over. Amelia wasn't the only one who had strayed, and sooner or later, my own sins would catch up to me. The whispers of temptation had led us both down a path of destruction, and now, there was no turning back. The days following Amelia's confession felt like I was trapped in a suffocating fog. The reality of her affair with Robert weighed on me, but even more crushing was the sense of inevitability. We had both been heading toward this for months, maybe even years, and now the cracks that had formed were splitting wide open, leaving everything we had built exposed and vulnerable. Work was my escape, though it no longer offered the solace it once had. Winning cases, securing victories, and receiving praise from colleagues felt hollow. I was going through the motions, pretending that my life wasn't falling apart outside the courtroom. But the weight of what was happening between Amelia and me followed me like a shadow, always lurking in the back of my mind. I hadn't told anyone about Amelia's affair. Not my closest friends, not my colleagues, not even Claire. The temptation to confide in her was strong, especially after what had happened between us at the bar. But I resisted. I wasn't ready to admit to anyone, least of all myself, that my marriage had truly crumbled. Instead, I found myself retreating into my own world, playing the role of the successful lawyer while avoiding the chaos that had become my personal life. I told myself that if I could keep it together professionally, maybe the rest would follow. Maybe Amelia would come back from Los Angeles and we'd figure out a way to fix things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The web of deception we had both spun was too thick, too tangled, and it wasn't just Amelia's betrayal that haunted me. It was my own. The kiss with Claire, the nights I had entertained the idea of walking away from my marriage, all of it was weighing me down. One afternoon, about a week after the call with Amelia, I found myself staring out the window of my office, watching the city below as people went about their lives. I envied them, the ones who seemed to have it all together, whose problems probably didn't extend beyond the mundane. My phone buzzed, breaking my reverie. It was a text from Claire. "We need to talk." My heart sank. I had been avoiding her since the night at the bar, not out of anger or shame, but because I didn't know how to deal with the mess I had created. Claire had become more than a colleague, more than a friend. She was an escape, a temptation I had almost succumbed to, and now she wanted answers. I texted her back, my fingers hesitant. "I'll come by your office later." A few hours later, I stood outside Claire's office, taking a deep breath before knocking. She opened the door almost immediately, her expression unreadable. She gestured for me to come in, closing the door softly behind me. There was a tension in the air, the kind that comes when two people know they've crossed a line but aren't sure where to go from there. "David," she began, her voice soft but firm, "we can't keep avoiding this." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I know." She sat down on the edge of her desk, crossing her arms. What happened between us? It wasn't just nothing, and I can't pretend it didn't mean anything. But I need to know where you stand. I looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Claire, I don't know. Everything is such a mess right now. Because of Amelia, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. I know she's been gone a lot, and I know things haven't been good between you two. But that doesn't explain what's going on with us. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Amelia had an affair. She's been seeing someone else for months. Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised. I'm sorry, she said after a moment, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. But that still doesn't answer the question. What do you want, David? From her? From me? I wished I had an answer for her, but the truth was, I didn't even know what I wanted for myself. Part of me wanted to fix things with Amelia, to somehow repair the damage we had done to each other. But another part of me, the part that had kissed Claire, the part that had wanted to walk away from my marriage, was ready to let it all go. I don't know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Claire stood up, walking over to me. David, I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for you to make a decision right now. But I need to know if you're still in this, your marriage, or if you're ready to move on. I looked up at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Was I ready to move on? Was I ready to let go of the life I had built with Amelia, even if that life had been built on lies? I don't know if I can fix things with Amelia, I admitted, my voice cracking. I don't know if I even want to. Claire reached out, placing a hand on my arm. Then don't force yourself to stay in something that's already broken. Her words made sense, but they didn't make the decision any easier. Letting go of Amelia, of our marriage, meant letting go of everything I had spent years building. But holding on to it meant living in a web of deception that was slowly suffocating me. Claire stepped closer, her face inches from mine. I'm here, David, whenever you're ready. I didn't kiss her. I didn't reach out for her, but I also didn't pull away. The tension between us hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if we were both waiting for something to happen. But I couldn't bring myself to take that final step. Not yet. I need time, I whispered, stepping back. Claire nodded, though I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Take the time you need, but don't take too long, David. Life's too short to stay trapped in something that doesn't make you happy. As I left her office, the weight of her words followed me. Life was too short. And yet, I wasn't sure I was ready to face the consequences of letting go. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I stared at the ceiling, the web of deception that had entangled my life pulling tighter around me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, one foot in a broken marriage and the other in a future I wasn't sure I was ready for. Something had to give, and soon. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between Amelia and me grew unbearable. She still hadn't returned from Los Angeles, and our conversations had dwindled to short, clipped exchanges about logistics, bills, house upkeep, our shared responsibilities. There was nothing left of the warmth that once filled our calls, no lingering affection or even anger. We were two strangers, tethered together by a legal document and a past that was quickly fading into irrelevance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Perhaps I was waiting for Amelia to finally tell me it was over, or maybe I was waiting for the courage to say it myself. Either way, we were stuck in limbo, and the silence between us was deafening. Amelia's affair with Robert hung over me like a cloud, but instead of confronting her directly, I had slipped deeper into my own deception. Claire and I continued to orbit each other at work, the unspoken connection between us growing stronger with every passing day. We never crossed the line again, but the temptation was always there, lingering in the air like an electric charge. One evening, after another long day at the office, I received a message from Amelia. She had finally returned from Los Angeles and was staying at a hotel downtown. I stared at the text for a long time, wondering what her reason for avoiding home could be this time. Was it guilt? Shame? Or was she simply done with the charade of our marriage, unwilling to return to a place that no longer felt like home? I decided to meet her. I couldn't live like this any longer, trapped in a marriage of lies, pretending that we could somehow salvage the wreckage. The time had come to confront the truth, no matter how painful. When I arrived at the hotel, I found Amelia sitting in the lounge, sipping a glass of wine. She looked as poised and beautiful as ever, but there was a coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if the Amelia I had once loved had been replaced by a woman I barely recognized. "David?" she greeted me, her voice flat. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, sitting down across from her. "You're back." "For now," she replied, taking another sip of her wine. "I thought it was time we talked." I let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? About what, Amelia? About how you've been having an affair for months? About how you've been lying to me, pretending that everything's fine when it's not?" Her expression didn't change. If my words stung, she didn't show it. "I'm not going to apologize for what I did. You and I both know that this marriage has been falling apart for a long time. I just happened to act on it first." I felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by the painful truth in her words. She wasn't wrong. We had both been slipping away from each other for years, even if neither of us had been willing to admit it. "And what now?" I asked, my voice tight. "Are you planning on running off with Robert? Starting a new life with him?" Amelia shrugged, her eyes fixed on the glass in her hand. "I don't know. I'm not even sure I want to be with him. But what I do know is that I can't keep pretending with you anymore." There it was, the truth, laid bare between us. Amelia was done pretending, and so was I. The marriage we had fought so hard to build was nothing more than a hollow shell, a facade we had kept up for the sake of appearances. "I don't want to keep pretending either," I admitted, the words heavy on my tongue. "But we can't just walk away from everything we've built." "What have we built, David?" Amelia asked, her voice sharp. "A life built on ambition and lies? A marriage where we both want something more, but are too afraid to let go? We've both been lying to ourselves and to each other." I wanted to argue with her, to defend the years we had spent together, but the truth was, she was right. Our marriage had become a performance, a carefully constructed act where we played the roles of the successful power couple while hiding the cracks beneath the surface. Amelia set down her glass, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for you to understand, but I think it's time we both admit that this isn't working. We're not the people we used to be." Her words hit me hard, but there was no denying them. We weren't the same people anymore. The love we had once shared had been swallowed by ambition, jealousy, and the relentless pursuit of success. And now, all that was left was resentment and regret. "What do you want, Amelia?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I want out," she said simply. "I want us to go our separate ways, and I want us to stop pretending that this marriage is salvageable." There it was, the end. I had been waiting for it, dreading it, but now that it was here, I felt strangely relieved. The weight of deception, the lies, the betrayals, it was all too heavy to carry any longer. "And what about Robert?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just wanted to understand how deep her betrayal had gone. She shrugged again. "I don't know. Maybe he's part of my future, maybe he's not. But this isn't about him, this is about us." I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman I had once loved. But she was gone. We were both gone, replaced by two people who had lost themselves in their ambitions and desires. "I'll talk to a lawyer," I said finally, the words bitter on my tongue. "We'll figure out the divorce." Amelia nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's probably for the best." As we sat there, the finality of our decision sinking in, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. The lies, the deception, it was all coming to an end. And while the future felt uncertain, I knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadows of a broken marriage. I stood up, nodding to Amelia. "Goodbye, Amelia." She looked up at me, her eyes cold but resigned. "Goodbye, David." And just like that, it was over. Our marriage, our life together, the future we had once envisioned. It all ended in that quiet, unremarkable hotel lounge. I walked out of the hotel into the cool night air, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. But as I stood there, staring at the city lights, I realized something. This wasn't just the end. It was also a beginning. The days that followed my conversation with Amelia felt surreal, as if I was living in the aftermath of a storm, picking up the pieces of a life that had been irrevocably changed. The divorce, once an unthinkable outcome, was now a reality. I met with my lawyer, laying out the facts with a detached, almost clinical tone. Everything had been about control up until now, but this felt like the one thing I couldn't control. letting go. Amelia and I had become ghosts in each other's lives. We avoided any unnecessary contact, and communication was funneled through our lawyers. I didn't ask her about Robert, and she didn't ask me about Claire. It was a mutual unspoken agreement. The past was the past, and we both had new paths to walk. But as much as I wanted to move forward, there was something that gnawed at me, a lingering suspicion that went beyond just the affair. It was as if I hadn't uncovered the full truth yet, that there were layers to Amelia's betrayal I hadn't even begun to peel back. I couldn't stop thinking about Robert. Who was he, really? And how had he managed to worm his way into Amelia's life so easily? I had convinced myself that their relationship had been purely driven by ambition. But what if there was more to it? What if Robert wasn't just another investor? What if he was something else entirely? The thought haunted me, and soon I found myself investigating him. It started small, a simple Google search, just to see if there were any red flags about his business. But the more I dug, the more I realized that Robert wasn't just an investor. He was a man with a reputation. His name was tied to a number of shady deals, lawsuits, and whispers of corruption that hadn't yet reached the mainstream. He operated in the gray areas of the business world, much like Amelia had in her spa empire. Suddenly, everything made sense. Robert wasn't just Amelia's lover. He was a man who could give her the power and success she craved, even if it came at a cost. And knowing Amelia, she would have been willing to pay that price, whatever it was. The truth hit me like a freight train. Their relationship wasn't just about ambition. It was about survival. Amelia had latched onto Robert because he offered her a way to stay on top in a world where power was everything. But the deeper I went, the more disturbing the details became. Robert had been implicated in a fraud case several years ago, though the charges had mysteriously been dropped. There were also rumors that he had ties to organized crime, using his business ventures as fronts for more illicit activities. I realized then that Amelia had been playing with fire, and I wondered if she even knew how dangerous Robert really was. I sat in my office late one night, staring at the screen, trying to process everything I had uncovered. Amelia wasn't just having an affair. She had entangled herself with a man who was far more dangerous than either of us had realized. And now, I wasn't sure how to protect her, or if I even should. As much as I hated what Amelia had done to me, part of me still cared for her. Our marriage might have been broken, but we had once loved each other, and that history wasn't something I could easily forget. I knew I had to warn her about Robert, even if she didn't want to hear it. She needed to know the truth before it was too late. The next morning, I called her. "David," she answered, her voice sharp like she was expecting a fight. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," I said, my tone serious. "It's important." There was a pause on the other end. "If this is about the divorce..." "It's not," I interrupted, my voice firm. "It's about Robert." I could hear her stiffen. "I don't want to talk about him." "You don't have to," I said quickly, "but you need to listen. He's not who you think he is, Amelia. I've been looking into him, and there are some things you need to know." "I don't care," she snapped. "This is none of your business, David." "None of my business?" I repeated, incredulous. "He's dangerous, Amelia. He's involved in things that you don't want to be part of, Consular. This isn't just about your affair anymore. This is about your safety." She laughed bitterly, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "My safety? You think I don't know who Robert is? You think I'm that naive?" I froze, her words hanging in the air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice cold. "Robert's business dealings are no secret to me. I didn't get to where I am by being oblivious, David. I've made choices, and I'll deal with the consequences." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Amelia knew. She knew about Robert's past, his connections, the danger he posed, and she had chosen to stay with him anyway. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm not like you, David," she said, her voice hard. "I'm not content with mediocrity. I want more, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Robert understands that. He gives me what you never could." I felt the room spin, her words crashing down on me. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. Amelia had sold herself to a man who could destroy her life, and she didn't even care. "You're playing with fire, Amelia," I warned, "and it's going to burn you." "Maybe," she said, her tone indifferent. "But at least I won't go down quietly." With that, she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. I had tried to warn her, to pull her back from the edge, but it was clear that Amelia had already made her choice. She was determined to walk this path, no matter the cost. And as much as I wanted to save her, I knew there was nothing I could do. Amelia had unmasked the truth, not just about Robert, but about herself. She was willing to sacrifice everything, her integrity, her safety, even her life, for the chance to stay on top. But what she didn't realize was that the web of deception she had spun was about to ensnare her. And when it did, there would be no way out. After my conversation with Amelia, the reality of how far she had fallen weighed on me heavily. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was now entangled in a dangerous game with a man who was capable of destroying everything she had worked for. And yet, she seemed determined to continue down that path, fully aware of the risks. Days passed, and I tried to focus on my work, but the nagging feeling that something terrible was coming wouldn't leave me. I found myself constantly checking the news, waiting for some headline about Robert or Amelia, some scandal that would expose everything. But the days dragged on in silence, and it only heightened my anxiety. I hadn't spoken to Claire much since our last conversation. The situation with Amelia had consumed me, leaving little room for anything else. I could sense Claire's patience wearing thin, but she hadn't pushed me, understanding that I was still unraveling from the collapse of my marriage. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out to her, to lean on her for support, but I held back. It didn't feel right to drag her into the mess of my life, especially when I wasn't sure where things were headed. Then, one evening, the phone call I had been dreading came. I was sitting in my office, reviewing documents from a case, when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something in my gut told me to answer it. "David Mercer?" a voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is David," I replied, my heart already racing. "This is Detective Samuels from the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm calling about your wife, Amelia Mercer." The blood drained from my face. "Is she okay?" I asked, my voice barely steady. There was a pause. "She's been in an accident, Mr. Mercer. We need you to come to Los Angeles as soon as possible." An accident? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. How could this happen? Was Robert involved? Was it an attack or just a tragic coincidence? "I'll be there," I managed to say before hanging up, my hands trembling. I barely remember the flight to Los Angeles. Everything felt like a blur, a haze of fear and dread. The thought of losing Amelia, despite everything that had happened between us, was too much to bear. I wasn't ready for this, for the finality of it all. When I arrived at the hospital, I was met by Detective Samuels, a tall man with a serious expression etched into his face. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. "She was in a car accident late last night," he explained. "Her car was run off the road. We're still investigating, but there are some unusual circumstances surrounding the crash." "Unusual?" I repeated, my mind spinning. "What do you mean?" The detective hesitated. "The vehicle that hit her didn't stop. We believe it was a deliberate act." A deliberate act. My heart sank as the full weight of his words hit me. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had targeted Amelia. "She's stable for now," the detective continued, "but she's in a coma. The doctors aren't sure if or when she'll wake up." I stood there, numb, the world around me fading into nothingness. A coma. Amelia was lying in a hospital bed, unconscious, and there was nothing I could do. "Was Robert involved?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective looked at me curiously. "Robert Matthews? He's been questioned, but there's no evidence linking him to the crash. For now, he's not a suspect." Not a suspect, but I knew better. Whether or not he was directly involved, Robert's presence in Amelia's life had led her here. She had been playing with fire, and now she was paying the price. I visited Amelia's room that evening, standing at the foot of her bed, watching the machines monitor her vital signs. She looked so small, so fragile, lying there with tubes and wires connected to her. It was hard to reconcile this image with the woman I had known, the powerful, ambitious, fiercely independent Amelia. Now she was vulnerable, helpless, and I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to speak to her again. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed in Los Angeles, waiting for any updates on Amelia's condition, though none came. The doctors remained cautious, warning me that her recovery could take weeks, months, or longer. And even then, there was no guarantee. As I waited, I began to piece together what had really happened. Amelia's life with Robert had been more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. She had been caught up in something far darker than either of us had realized. And now, someone had tried to silence her. I didn't know if it was Robert himself or someone he was connected to, but one thing was clear. Amelia had been in over her head. One afternoon, as I sat in the hospital cafeteria, my phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "I heard about Amelia. I'm so sorry, David. Do you need anything?" I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Claire had been patient with me, waiting in the wings while I dealt with the collapse of my marriage. But now, with Amelia in a coma, I didn't know what the future held. I texted back, "Thank you. I'm okay for now." It was a lie, of course. I wasn't okay. My life had fallen apart, and the woman I had once loved was lying in a hospital bed, teetering on the edge of life and death. The next few days brought more questions than answers. The police continued their investigation into the crash, but leads were scarce. Robert, it seemed, had distanced himself from the situation, though I knew better than to trust his innocence. Amelia's decision to align herself with him had led her down a dark path, and now she was paying the ultimate price. I returned to the hospital every day, hoping for some sign of improvement. But each day, Amelia remained unconscious, locked in her own world, unreachable. I spoke to her sometimes, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. I told her about the life we had once dreamed of, about the future we had planned. I told her about the mistakes we had both made, the lies we had told, and the love we had lost along the way. And then, one evening, as I sat by her bedside, I realized something. Amelia wasn't just the victim in this. She had made her choices, just as I had. We had both been complicit in the destruction of our marriage, and we had both played a part in the love deception that had led to this moment. As I watched her, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had spent so long trying to untangle the lies to figure out where things had gone wrong. But the truth was, there was no single moment, no single betrayal that had broken us. It had been a slow unraveling, a series of choices, small and large, that had led us to this point. The life we had built was in ruins, and there was no going back. The days at the hospital stretched into weeks, each one blending into the next. Amelia remained in her coma, her condition stable but unchanged. The doctors offered little hope of a sudden recovery, and I began to accept that she might never wake up. The woman I had once loved, the woman who had betrayed me and yet still held a piece of my heart, was gone, trapped in a world I couldn't reach. I visited her every day, more out of obligation than hope. My life had fallen into a rhythm: work, hospital, home. I was drifting, lost in the ruins of what had once been. Claire had reached out a few more times, offering support, but I hadn't responded. I didn't know what to say to her. How could I let someone else into my life when I couldn't even make sense of it myself? Then one night, as I sat in my office, a call came that would change everything. It was Detective Samuels again. "Mr. Mercer," he began, his voice heavy with urgency. "We've uncovered new information about Amelia's accident." I felt my heart rate spike, the tension in his voice setting off alarm bells. "What is it?" "There was no accident," he said, his words hitting me like a sledgehammer. "Amelia's car was deliberately forced off the road. We've confirmed it was an attempted murder." I sank back into my chair, the room spinning around me. "Murder? Are you sure?" "Positive," Samuel said. "We've identified the car that hit her. It was registered to a shell company tied to Robert Matthews." The mention of Robert's name felt like ice water down my spine. Of course, he had always been in the shadows, lurking behind every decision Amelia had made in recent months. But to try to kill her? Was he that desperate? Or had she known something that made her a threat? "We believe Robert orchestrated the hit," Samuels continued. "Amelia may have been a liability to him. Perhaps she knew too much." I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. Amelia had gotten too close to Robert's dangerous dealings, and now he had tried to eliminate her. It all made sense, the way she had seemed so resigned during our last conversation, her cold acceptance of her fate. She had known. She had known that getting involved with Robert meant walking a dangerous line, and she had done it anyway. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "We're preparing to bring him in for questioning," Samuel said. "But we need to build a stronger case. We need anything you can provide that links Amelia to Robert's dealings. Financial records, emails, anything that shows she was involved or knew about his illegal activities." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'll help, whatever it takes." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I combed through every piece of evidence I could find. Emails between Amelia and Robert, business transactions that didn't add up, even notes she had scribbled in her planner that hinted at meetings with shady figures. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. And as I gathered it together, the full extent of Amelia's involvement became clear. She had been deeper in Robert's world than I had ever imagined, entangled in deals that went far beyond spa investments and business partnerships. As I handed over the evidence to Detective Samuels, a grim sense of satisfaction settled over me. I wasn't just helping the police. I was finally unmasking the full truth of who Amelia had become. And in doing so, I was unmasking Robert as well, exposing the man who had nearly destroyed her. Then came the day of Robert's arrest. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds hung low over the city, casting everything in a gray, oppressive light. I was sitting in my office, watching the news coverage of the arrest unfold on TV. Robert had been taken into custody at one of his downtown offices, surrounded by police and cameras. His face was calm, stoic, as if he had expected this all along. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that his carefully constructed empire was finally crumbling. I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of justice. He had tried to take Amelia's life, and now he was facing the consequences. But as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the sadness. Robert was going to prison, but Amelia was still lying in that hospital bed, lost to the world. That evening, I went to the hospital, as I had done every night for weeks. The room was quiet, the steady beeping of machines the only sound. I sat beside Amelia, watching her chest rise and fall, wondering if she would ever wake up to see the man who had nearly killed her face justice. "I did it," I said softly, speaking to her as though she could hear me. "Robert's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." There was no response, of course. There never was. But as I sat there, I felt a strange peace settle over me. For the first time in months, I wasn't weighed down by anger or betrayal. I had uncovered the truth, and I had done everything I could to protect Amelia, even if it had come too late. As I prepared to leave, I glanced at her one last time, my heart heavy. "I'm sorry, Amelia," I whispered, "for everything." And then, just as I turned to go, something happened. It was subtle at first, so subtle I almost missed it. But then I saw it. Her fingers twitched. Just a slight movement, barely noticeable, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Amelia?" I whispered, moving closer to her. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of life. She was waking up. Amelia's eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitching again as I stood frozen in shock. After weeks of waiting, after everything we had been through, she was waking up. I rushed to her side, my heart pounding in my chest, torn between relief and fear. Relief that she was still alive, and fear of what her waking would mean for both of us. "Amelia," I whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes slowly opened, blinking against the harsh hospital lights. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze unfocused as it wandered around the room. Then, her eyes landed on me, and something flickered in them, a mixture of recognition and confusion. "David?" she croaked, her voice weak, barely audible. "I'm here," I said, taking her hand in mine. "You're in the hospital. You've been in a coma. Do you remember what happened?" She stared at me, her brow furrowing as she tried to piece it all together. "The car. I was driving, and then, I don't know." Her voice trailed off, her memory of the accident still fragmented. I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "You were in an accident. Someone forced you off the road. It was Robert, Amelia. He tried to kill you." Her eyes widened slightly, the name triggering something deep within her. She seemed to remember more now, pieces of a puzzle coming together. "Robert," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. He told me everything would be fine. I thought I could trust him." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over us. Amelia's involvement with Robert had led her here, to this hospital bed, on the edge of death. And yet, she had survived. But at what cost? I tried to warn you, I said softly, my voice heavy with the emotions I had buried for so long. I tried to tell you that Robert was dangerous, but you wouldn't listen. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked away, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I know, she whispered. I was blind. I was so caught up in what he promised me, in the power, the success. I didn't realize how far I had fallen. We sat in silence for a long moment, the gravity of her words hanging in the air between us. She had fallen, just as I had. We had both been consumed by our ambitions, by the drive to succeed at all costs. And in the process, we had destroyed everything we once held dear, our marriage, our love, our integrity. I'm sorry, David, she said suddenly, her voice trembling. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, for pushing you away. I thought I was doing what I had to do, but now I see how wrong I was. I looked at her, my heart torn between forgiveness and the lingering pain of her betrayal. Hearing her apology, seeing the regret in her eyes, brought back all the memories of what we had once been, the love, the dreams, the life we had built together. But it also reminded me of how far we had fallen, how deeply we had hurt each other. I'm sorry too, I said quietly. I wasn't blameless. I made mistakes too. We both let ambition destroy us. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Is it too late, David? For us? Is there any way to fix this? Her question hung in the air, and I didn't know how to answer it. I had spent so long imagining this moment, wondering what I would say if Amelia ever woke up. Part of me had wanted to walk away, to leave the wreckage of our marriage behind and start fresh. But now, seeing her here, vulnerable and broken, I wasn't sure I could. I don't know, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. We've hurt each other so much. I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Amelia closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling onto her cheeks. I understand. I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't forgive me. I looked down at her hand in mine, the weight of the years we had spent together pressing on my heart. Our marriage had been built on ambition, on the pursuit of power and success. But beneath all of that, there had once been love, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find it again. I don't know if I can forget everything that's happened, I said slowly, but I do know that I don't want to carry this anger anymore. I don't want to live in the past. Her eyes met mine, filled with a glimmer of hope. Does that mean? I'm willing to try, I said softly. But it's going to take time, Amelia. We've both made mistakes, and we need to figure out who we are now, after everything. She nodded, her expression one of gratitude and relief. Thank you, David. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. As I sat there, holding her hand, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or pretending that the past hadn't happened. It was about accepting the pain, the betrayal, and the mistakes, and choosing to move forward despite them. It was about redemption, not just for Amelia, but for me as well. The days that followed were filled with slow recovery. Amelia remained in the hospital, undergoing treatment for her injuries, while the investigation into Robert's criminal activities continued. He was facing charges for attempted murder, along with a slew of other crimes that had finally come to light. His empire was crumbling, and soon he would be behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else. As Amelia recovered, we began the long, painful process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy. The wounds were still fresh, and the memories of what we had done to each other lingered. But we took it one day at a time, talking about the things we had never spoken about before. The lies, the secrets, the regrets. We were finally unmasking the truth, not just about our marriage, but about ourselves. Months later, when Amelia was finally discharged from the hospital, we stood at the edge of a new beginning. Our marriage would never be the same, but it didn't need to be. We weren't the same people anymore, and that was okay. We had both paid the price for our ambition, and now it was time to rebuild, not from the ashes of our old life, but from the lessons we had learned. As we walked out of the hospital together, I felt a strange sense of peace. The cost of redemption had been high, but in the end, it was worth it. We had found our way back to each other, not through perfection or easy forgiveness, but through the hard, painful work of facing the truth. And as we stepped into the light of a new day, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together.